So once again, to create a table, we created a class file. Any class can be saved as a table. You just annotate it with entity. That means this class has to be saved as a table. Whichever column you want to be a primary key, you annotated with @id. Remember, it's all from javax.persistence, so that we can use these classes even if the Hibernate technology changes to some other ORM technology. In the test employee, you have something called as annotation configuration object. To the config annotation configuration object, you have to add all the class files that are annotated in your project. You call this config.configure, which reads the Hibernate configuration files and understands what is the name of the database and where the database is located. You call the schema export basically to drop the schema and you can recreate the tables. The first true statement is for the log files, that is printed to the log files, and the second true statement is, do you want to run it against the database? That is a second true statement. You need to run this only once in your project. After the tables are created, don't run it again and again. You lose all the existing data because it drops the tables and recreates it. After this is done, we created the table. We created something called as a session factory. It's very resource intensive, so be careful about using it. And then from the session factory, we say get current session to create sessions, and then we begin the transaction. We create objects, whichever objects you want to save, we create the objects, and then this object which is not associated with a session is called a transient object. To make it a persistent object, we have to associate the object with the session, so we call session.save and we pass the object, and then we call the session.getTransaction.commit. This is the line it actually executes the insert statement to the database, and we were able to create the data in the tables. Thank you. Now that we have finished the first chapter about Hibernate, we learned how to create a table out of a class, and then how to save an object as a record in the table. Let us do a quick review and see how much we have learned till now. Now the first question is, what are the uses of the entity and ID annotation tags? Now if you remember, the entity annotation indicates that the class should persist to the database, that is create a table out of the class, and the ID annotation represents a unique primary key. This is what we did. We put an entity to say that this class has to be persisted and that the employee ID is the primary key. Good. So second question, how do you tell Hibernate which classes are to be persisted? Okay, we have some entity annotated tags. How do you tell Hibernate which classes are to be persisted? We have to first create an annotation configuration object, and then we have to add those class files to that config.add annotated class. So this way you tell Hibernate, okay, these are my annotated classes. Now you have to tell them, okay, now Hibernate, these classes need to be persisted or create a table out of. So you will see this one, we are relating Hibernate with these annotated classes. Now third question, which line of code allows Hibernate to understand how to access the underlying database? Well, config.configure, and then you pass the hibernate.configuration.xml file. This is the line, if you remember, which understands what table, what database, and what is the location of the database and all those things. It reads the configuration file, and then it understands which database should it persist to. Which object connects to the underlying database and generates the various tables? Do you remember? It is the schema export object. This is the object which connects to the database, and then it creates the table. So we usually comment it out once the tables are created. Next question. What is a transient instance? Objects not associated with a session are transient instances. That is, in the code, if you notice, here the employee object is a transient instance, and here it is associated with the session, so it is no longer transient right here in this particular line. What are the steps involved in saving an instance? That is, we just saved Alex. What are the various steps involved? First is we need to create a session factory, and then based on the session factory we need to create a session, and we call session.begin transaction, basically like we are telling Hibernate, hey, be ready for the transaction. Then we pass the objects that need to be saved. Don't worry about the save or update, we will see about what it is later on. And then we call the commit transaction. This is the place which actually saves the particular object to the table. Which object is fairly resource intensive and should be carefully used? If you remember, I said it is the session factory. We should not create a lot of session factories. We will learn about how to restrict creating session factories later on. How do you create a session? Well, we create a session from factory.getCurrentSession. This session object you can create as many as you want. What is the use of session.getTransaction.commit? Now, if you remember, this is the line where you actually save to the database tables. Okay, it will save the objects associated with the session to the database, and that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed this lessons. Catch you very soon with the second chapter. Thank you.